We thought before we get started today, though, we'd like to just address a few things that we noticed, because in terms of love, because we find if we don't do this, behaviour tends to continue for the next few days as well. And it's far better if we can do this and talk with you about a few issues of love that relate to the belief systems, actually, that we've been talking to you about yesterday. So, in terms of which one to discuss first, Anna's not here today.
Yes, she is.
Oh, there she is. Okay, so if I can have a mic with you, Anna, and John?
Here.
A mic with you, thank you.
This is
All righty, so.
This is the bit where there was a board part.
Yeah, so, oh yeah, that's right, I remember now. There was something that happened with both of you during the lunchtime, which we would like to discuss because it illustrates some points about the illusions that we have a tendency to have about whether we think we know what we're talking about versus actually knowing what we're talking about and so forth. So you remember just before lunch, I think it was yesterday, you said you were very honest and open with us about how you felt about God. Remember, we were talking about God, and you mentioned the general feelings that you had about God being in nature and why you wanted to feel that way, and you being God and why you wanted to.
Yeah, I definitely remember.
You remember those?
And it was very lovely. I don't know if anyone else
Yeah.
remembers, because you were sort of, oh my gosh, all these pennies dropping, and you were really just being yourself and being quite humble and open with the group.
It was very good.
It's really lovely to experience.
Yeah, and having people who express themselves in that humble manner, we really like to see that and also encourage that, right? But John came away during the break. We just heard the side as we were coming past you, and you were lecturing Anna about some of the things that she said before the break. Can you remember that, John?
I remember the dialogue, and I never thought of it as lecture.
A lecture, yeah.
But it is something.
How did Anna feel about it? Was it a lecture, Anna?
Yes.
Yeah. And were you trying to get away from it?
I was trying to be polite.
Yes.
So you were.
But all of your body language was saying,
stop.
I don't want to be having this
Right.
interaction.
This is where it comes to how women deal with men who are pushing them around. And John, you were pushing her around. It was not invited. Your comments towards her were not invited by her. So it wasn't. You were trying to overcome her free will in order to have your discussion with her. You felt you were doing her a favour, which is actually quite arrogant to believe such a thing, particularly when you're trying to overcome somebody's free will. But many men do this with women. Many men. Like, it's a very common thing that happens during, with people in their relationships. And it also happens with friendships and everything, where the men think, I know the logical answer to this. And interestingly enough, Anna did understand the comments she was making, and she could feel the comments that she was making were not God's definition of God or God's definition of what's loving to feel towards God. So she knew all that already, but she was just being very honest about what she was feeling, which is very good.
And yes, and
Yeah.
Because the comments that I heard as we were going to lunch, and if you remember, I leaned over and I said,
yes,
she gets it, John. You were saying, you were really lecturing Anna about how limiting her beliefs were and how limiting upon God that was.
Yeah.
And
it was definitely a lecture because she never asked you to do it.
That's true.
She never requested, she never thought, I know John knows more about this than me, and I think I should go to John and get some advice. And she never came to you and asked for help in any way. You just felt that you could offer that advice without her request or desire for it. Does that make sense? And ironically, you also knew far less than she did about what she was talking about. Ironically, even though you believed differently.
And this is very important, where we talked about this last weekend or now, about how men live in their intellect very often. They avoid emotion in their intellect. And actually, you're not having a relationship with God yet, and yet Anna is closer to one by exposing what her emotional blocks to God are. You are living in your intellect, understanding, you think, why it's important to have a relationship with God, and you think you understand the nature of God and how God's universe works, but you haven't yet examined the emotional blockages you have to God. But you believe you're an expert over Anna, which, from God's perspective, is quite the opposite. She knows more about her relationship with God than you know about yours at this point.
Yeah. Now,
This is the book.
Anna, this is what you could have said. This would be a loving thing to say.
Okay, but can
Number
I
one.
say something real quick?
Sure you can.
I did the same thing yesterday to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand that.
Well, they could have said this
we were
to
talking
you.
about this, right?
I didn't ask for your advice. One.
Two, you're being unloving. Three,
Yeah, I'm.
go away. Anybody who's being unloving to you is unable to teach you anything. This is a major point that each of you need to understand. If somebody's being unloving to you, they are not able to teach you anything. Right? It's also loving for you to say, you're trying to overcome my free will, which is, I didn't ask for your advice. Right? It's also loving for you to say, that is an unloving thing. Like, don't talk to me unless I've asked for your advice. Right? So you notice with Mary and I, we because you come to our sessions, we're presuming you are asking for our advice. Right? But if we were at your home, we would say a lot less unless you asked. And sometimes I have been with people and I can feel they don't want to ask anything, and so I hardly speak at all. Many people think I speak all the time, and that's not true. It's very frequent that I'm quiet an entire day because nobody has asked anything, or I don't feel engaged with the conversation they are having with other people. I don't feel that it's important or necessary. And so I say nothing. Right? When you, and bear in mind that this is very much, most of you, when you know your free will is trying to be overcome by somebody else, many of you try to be polite. But it's not polite from God's perspective. It's not polite. To be truly polite would be to say exactly what you're feeling. I didn't ask for your advice. I don't want to listen to what you're saying. That would be the most polite thing to say, because it would be the most in agreement with the truth of how you feel. So it's the most polite thing to say. Anything else is a facade, a falsity, a presentation of error, your error, and why do you need to do that? So every time you sit there in a conversation, not wanting to be a part of that conversation, not wanting to listen to the conversation, you are actually being impolite from God's perspective, not polite. And you're also not being honest, which is the more important thing. Truth sets you free. That also means when you speak a truth, you will be free. So if you think about a thing where somebody's come up to you and they're talking about something that you don't really want to talk about, and by saying I don't want to talk about that, you become free of the conversation that you don't want to have.
And also, you give the person, if you think about these three statements, John, if Anna had said to you the first thing, I didn't ask for your advice, John, that's the first opportunity you had to go, oh, what am I doing? Why am I doing this?
Why am I trying to force my advice on somebody? You know?
Now, if you didn't stop at that point, then she could say, you're being very unloving, John.
Now,
That gives you another
gives you
opportunity.
another opportunity.
And then if you ignore all those, then you just have
And
to
she
say
could
to the
just say,
person,
"Go away."
or I'm going away.
And you would think, oh, she's not a very nice woman, but she's actually being the most loving she can be in the circumstance if she did those three things.
She's not attacking you, she's not trying to pull you down, she's not trying to be polite, she's not putting up until you finish. So she's actually being very honest with you and giving you every opportunity to make different choices.
And you couldn't sense in the moment that actually Anna wasn't listening to you anyway, so what's the point of you speaking? She wasn't listening anyway. She was already going, I just want to get away from him. I just want to get away from him, is what she was feeling. And that's why we smiled at you when we went past, because we could just see that dynamic going on. But it raises an issue for many of you with regard to what you believe is your understanding of divine truth. You see, when you do things like that, you demonstrate you don't understand God's truth at all. Because the very first critical part of understanding God's truth is honouring a person's free will. And as soon as you're trying to overcome another person's free will, you are actually dishonouring divine truth, God's truth, in the moment by the attempt to overcome free will. God never does that with you, right? If God chose to, he'd be in your ear, because remember, he created your ear. He knows how to manipulate it if he wanted to manipulate it. He could be in your ear every day moment of your life if he decided he was going to try to overcome your free will, couldn't he? And many spirits, and some of you experiences, do that to you, where they're in your ear, and you could sort of, or they're in your thoughts, trying to influence your thoughts, which, by the way, is also an unloving thing to do. And because it's a manipulation of your free will, you haven't asked them to do such things. So even that is obviously an unloving thing for somebody to do. So for me to be in Mary's face and in her ears, talking to her about things that she doesn't want to hear about at all, is an unloving act on my part. And the average person would go, oh, she's so resistive. And I go, no wonder, because you're trying to overcome her will. And anytime somebody attempts to overcome the will of another, you are actually now, from God's perspective, being very unloving and even abusive to the person.
And actually, when someone is trying to overcome my will, the appropriate response is to resist.
Yeah.
That is loving.
The appropriate response is to not listen. And somebody does that. That's the loving response, is to not listen. Make sense? Jane?
So an example of this that Kim and I often get into is one of us will be like, oh, you're being unloving. Well, now you're being mad. And then, no, I'm not mad, you're mad. And it's like, it just goes back and forth, and it's like, yeah, it spirals down into all
Yeah.
that stuff.
So why does that happen? Like in a relationship, you often see these things happen, right? Well, it firstly happens because at the beginning, the person didn't ask you for advice. Now, in a relationship, it's a little different, isn't it? Because you're forced, usually you're living with the person. In a romantic relationship, you're living with the person. Now, the fact that you're living with the person means now that you're going to have conversations sometimes, right?
And there's going to be things you have to sort out, aren't there? Like
Correct.
physical, logistical, and even interactional things.
Yeah, and so naturally, there is going to have to be conversation about what's loving and what isn't. But if both of you disagree about what's loving, then presume that both of you are wrong and that you need to do more work finding out what God would feel is the loving thing in your circumstance or situation. Does that make sense?
And
Yeah.
remember when we talked about this yesterday, the way that you're going to find out more about how God feels about it is first having your own feelings about it.
Now, the person who has a relationship with God or a closer relationship with God in the relationship is going to be more right than the person who has a lower relationship with God.
I'm
Yeah.
smiling because James
You know, Kev, that you haven't had a desire for a relationship with God very much, and you know that Kimberly does.
Yeah.
So if you were wise, it would be important to listen to her more than you would normally even listen, knowing that she does have a relationship with God and you don't. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah. So the humble thing in that circumstance would be to do that. Now, if you know that you're also more intellectual than the other person, and the other person has more desire for a relationship with God, then they've got two advantages over you. They understand something at an emotional level that you may not understand, and they also are more open to receiving information from God as well about the subject. So now they have a couple of advantages over you who are just being in your mind or in your intellect. Make sense?
Yeah.
So if there is a disagreement, each person needs to learn first to look at themselves rather than just fight for their opinion, right? But an uninvited conversation that is not between partners, say, in the home where you've got to sort things out, but an uninvited conversation, even then, you've got to start to consider, well, is it wise me even talking about it? So an example of that is, let's say Mary does something every day, like maybe, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of what she does every day. Well, I'll make something up.
Okay, there's one I did this morning.
Oh, the one you did this morning. Let's try that one.
Okay, don't do it every day.
No.
I usually, when I wash my hair, this might be TMI for you guys, but I wash my hair and my hair comes out. Anyone with long hair, that usually happens. And usually in the shower, I put it in one spot and then I take it out and put it in the bin. But this morning I forgot to do that, and I found Jesus coming out of the shower, taking it. I was like, oh.
I don't understand why it's gross, but anyway, I had no problem doing it at all.
Yes, but it was very loving to you.
Well, to my mind, I'm happy to do those things for Mary if Mary's forgotten to do them. I know she's just forgotten. I'm happy to do something that she's just forgotten and pick it up and put it in a bin. Mary got all creeped out about it, but I didn't. So I just put it in the bin, and Mary goes, oh, no, and I go, you don't have to worry about it. So nothing wrong with that from my perspective.
Well, it was thoughtless, you know. If I did that every day, it would be really unloving. Yeah.
Let's say she purposefully did that every day. Like just left it there every day. And every day I was pulling out the hair, putting it in the rubbish. Something that she needs to do because of her personal responsibility for self. It would be a love of self issue, wouldn't it? Firstly, because anybody who loves themselves looks after their own environment. Secondly, it would also be a love of the person you're living with perspective. If they're using the same shower as you in particular, then of course they've got to deal with you being unloving to yourself every day. And also, therefore, you're also being unloving to them every day. Now, under those circumstances, you would sit down and have a chat about the issue, right? Now, how you have a chat, of course, would have to be, if it was in harmony with love, you would raise it as an issue of love of self, and also an issue of love of both. Both. If Mary's doing it, for example, then it's an issue of her love of self and an issue of her love of me. If I was doing it, it would be an issue where I don't love myself and I don't love Mary. Does that make sense? And so if I realise that, then we'd have to start looking at, and because there's two of us, we can start looking at, why would I do such things? Like, why would I think such things are good to do? Why would I believe that, leaving a mess behind me wherever I go is an okay thing at any time, whether I'm living alone or living with a person. But in particular, when I'm living with a person now, not just myself and my own lack of love to myself is affected, but also the lack of love that I have for the other person is also affected. So why wouldn't I examine the reasons why I do such things? And the person who's annoyed by it, if somebody is annoyed, like I said, I don't get annoyed by those things. I often go around doing things for other people. They don't even notice what I'm doing, right? And so it doesn't bother me very much to do such things. Of course, if it's a constant thing that's going every day in your life, then obviously you'd have to talk about it with the person. But if you're annoyed about such things, you'd also have to look at that too. Why are you annoyed rather than dealing with the issue in a more loving manner? Because annoyance is really anger, and anger is really unloving. So why aren't you choosing to deal with it in a more loving manner? What does it make you feel? See, the average person on the receiving end of that feels unloved, uncared for, like not considered, right? And then the person, they don't want to feel that, and so what they'd love to do instead is have an argument, stop the other person from making them, as they call it, feel that. But actually, these are feelings that must be inside, because you wouldn't feel that if you had dealt with those feelings. And then on the other side, the person who's doing it all the time needs to look at, well, why do I want to be unloving all the time? What's going on for me? What drives that behaviour for me? Is it because my view of love is that when somebody tidies up after me, they love me? And that would have been a learned behaviour in childhood, perhaps, because many of you mothers, as you know, you ran around tidying up after your children, right, when they were little, and all you did in doing that was taught them that love is tidying up after them, right? You didn't enforce them tidying up after themselves, but instead what you did was you encouraged them to make a mess and you tidy it up. Makes you feel like you're valid as a mother, but unfortunately for the child it also makes the child feel like that the measure of love is somebody tidying up after them. Right? So it makes them feel that, which is a very unloving thing for them to eventually deal with, and later in life it'll be brought up usually in a relationship. So what I'm saying here is that many of us, instead of looking at ourselves and looking at what the motivations are, we're into the addiction we have straight away, and that also occurs in relationship, and this is why in the end we end up in arguments. Now, if a person such as yourself, Jen, wants to argue with Kimberly being a softer person and more connected to God, she would want to argue less, generally. But at some point, she's going to have a disagreement with you if she can't agree with what you do. At some point, that's going to happen, isn't it? And the best point for it to happen is as fast as possible. So as close to the time that you did it as it possibly could be is the best point to do it. And then once that's done, it gives you both an opportunity to address your love issues. So let's look at the Anna-John thing that happened yesterday. On one side, you've got a woman, in this case, who didn't ask for advice, who knew that the man was being unloving to her by trying to force his advice on her, but she was unwilling to say anything about it directly. Make sense? So if you were looking at the love issue yourself, you'd go, why do I do that? And particularly, why do I do that with men? Like, why do I let men just run roughshod over me like this all the time, rather than actually see that I didn't ask for their advice, and oftentimes I feel like I already know what's going on. Right? And why do I let that happen? So there's got to be stuff with dad, isn't there, in that? And stuff about getting, not wanting to appear like you're a bad woman to the man. Because usually, if you say this to a man, and then you say this to a man, and then you say that to a man, how does he respond after that? He's usually furious with you after that.
Or, which is what John did with me just now, projects a lot of like, oh my
I
gosh,
don't
you're
understand.
so mean to me.
Yeah,
You're hurting me.
Yeah.
This hurts. What? And then most women go, oh my gosh, I don't want to be a hurtful person. And it's a way that we back off.
Yeah, so most men manipulate women by projecting at the woman that they're being hurtful, when actually the man himself has taken an action that's out of harmony with free will towards the woman and expects the woman to respond. And many of you men have this problem with women. And the reason why you have the problem with women is because it was created with your mother, where your mother listened to you more than she listened to other people in the family, where she honoured you more, where she listened to what you wanted to say more without considering or dealing with the fact that you were being demanding and you were trying to overcome somebody else's free will. Now, on the other end, John, I would have to look at why I believe my advice is worthy for Anna to listen to. I've got to have arrogance in that place. Right? I've got to be arrogant to actually force my advice on a person who has not asked for it. Right? You see?
If I can make an observation, I was told to shut up and be quiet for most of my early childhood, and
Yep.
I have very difficulty with social graces. I don't have any friends to speak of. I stay at home all the time, so I'm not good at. But when a subject
See,
comes
now
up,
you're telling the reason why you were unloved.
well, what happened yesterday?
No,
I
just stop
realized-
for a moment.
Okay.
You've got to listen to what I've just said to you.
Why am I unloved?
You're actually telling me the reason why you're unloved.
Right.
And this happens frequently. So
Agreed.
I raise an issue of love, and then the person says to me, oh, the reason why I do that is blah, 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 blah.
Right.
No, it's not the reason. It's not the reason. It's the excuse you'll give yourself to overcome the reason. So the reason why you do this is not because of your not being allowed to say things when you're a child.
No, that I wasn't
Like
finished.
social.
No, what I really wanted to say is that I very rarely have an opportunity to get in a conversation with anybody about divine truth, and this topic is fascinating to me, the fact that God is
But it was
nature.
a conversation you were forcing on another.
Well, I thought she was interested. If there was a
No,
guy, I would have done
no,
the same.
you were forcing it on another.
Well-
If you could feel her feelings,
Well, she was in a hurry to leave me.
well, yeah, you
Yeah.
even knew that.
I tried to cut it short, yeah.
And you knew that, but you still wanted the addiction of being heard.
But I'm not aware that I have an addiction to
Well-
not be
You are aware because you just said you were.
heard, aware, no. Well, what I'm trying to say.
No, I want you to stop.
Okay, right.
I want you to stop. Because you're not hearing what I'm saying to you about it. And this is the problem you're going to face with your future. Is because and this is a problem most people face with their future. They want to tell the story about why they did what they did.
For context.
Sorry.
I was just trying to give context, my feelings.
No,
at the time,
no,
and
just
I
stop.
really need to strike up
See,
a conversation.
you're doing it with me. I don't want to hear your context.
Okay.
Your context is your justification for being unloving to somebody else. As I just said, overcoming somebody's free will, which is what you were doing yesterday, is one of the worst things you can do.
Oh, so
You understand?
Well, my understanding is I shouldn't try to strike up a dialogue with anybody about divine truth.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm
unless
saying
they ask for it.
yes.
Got it, okay.
Yes, unless they ask for it.
Nobody asks for it. So
Yeah, and you
forget
can
about
pray for an
conversation.
opportunity and allow them to come up with the opportunity. You can even make a general comment about something about that you've learnt, if you wanted to, and just be sensitive to whether they engage that or just ignore it. If they ignore it, don't go any further, because that's their answer. See, a lot of people won't do this with you. But what do? We justify what we did. We minimise what we did. We shift the blame onto mum in this case, or family not allowing me to talk in our childhood. And all of that is our justification for continuing the unloving act. And in that place, we're not seeing our sin. All we're doing is justifying our own unloving act, right? And this is the problem we face, and many of you face this. When an unloving thing is raised with you, internally you've got your own sin coming up with ideas as to why you should continue it. It's fighting for itself.
Well, not so much to continue it, but understand what went
You
wrong.
just
and
did
why
it
it
again. I
caused
didn't
it.
ask for your comment now.
Oh,
I didn't ask for it.
Sorry.
And this is you're doing it even in this conversation with me.
Oh,
Like, this is my space, is it not?
Right.
You are my guest,
Absolutely.
are you not?
Yes, yes.
And if you're my guest in my space, And why do I let you put up your hand? It's for what purpose? To? No, not to share. No, I'm not interested in what you want to share. What's the reason? It's to ask a question about what I'm teaching. That's why I let you put up your hand and give you a microphone. You understand? No other reason. No other reason. But all of you think, I've got my addictions, I can exorcise my addictions in this environment now that I've got this microphone in my hand. It's sort of like, no, you can't. This is my space. I don't want you to exercise your addictions because your addictions are unloving. I would like you to become a loving person. And this brings me to the section of stories. Yesterday, you get the mic in your hand and off you go with your story. Now you're forcing 60 other people to listen to your story. Just like John was actually doing right now, right? And right, you were doing Fernanda yesterday, and there's a number of other people, less so actually, but some others, Cecilia.
Yes, you know who you are.
Justin, you were doing it.
Yeah.
So there are a number of people who were doing it yesterday. Your story is and you want to tell your story because you don't want to feel your story. That's why you want to tell it. We don't need to tell you our story. Telling you our story would take 2,000 years. Because we've had 2,000 years of story, and it's going to take just as long to tell it as it is to experience it, right? If I was really thorough about it. And do I want to put that on you? No, I don't. Like, you need to learn to have your own life, and I need to learn to have mine. And once we become more loving like that, we will actually enjoy each other's company more, and then I will give you an opportunity sometimes to tell me your story. So sometimes not in this space, not in a seminar space, but sometimes we come up to you privately and say, what happened in your life? What did you do then? Where were you born, and where do you come from, and what kind of childhood did you have, and a lot of these things Mary and I ask many of you in a private setting, and the reason why we do is because we're interested in you. But the main purpose for us to getting together in these seminars is not for you to share your story. It's for us to tell you some truth, to share some truth with you. And you don't have to accept it. And all you need to do if you don't want to accept it is walk out the door. That's all you have to do. You don't have to do anything else.
Number 3.
Go away. That's what you want to do. Yeah. So that's all you have to do. You don't have to do anything else. But when you're telling a story to a captive audience that you didn't even create, you are being unloving. You are forcing them to use their will to listen to you. Can you see that? That's what you're doing. You're forcing them to spend their time listening to you when they came to this seminar not to listen to you. They didn't even know you before they came to the seminar, probably. They came to the seminar to listen to divine truth, not to you. Does that make sense? Now there's times when Mary and I, when you ask a question, we might say, why have you asked that question? We dig a bit more deeper into the psyche, the psychology of it. And under those circumstances, of course, it's appropriate to give straight answers about the psychology of these things. But when you force it on a person, so you put up your hand, get the microphone and say, well, when I was young, there's a number of songs along that. I could go into those songs, but you're not here to listen to me sing, are you, either? Yeah. And I wouldn't advise you listening to me sing either. You're here to listen to divine truth. So it's important to come to understand that when we force ourselves on others and force other people to listen to us through circumstance, we are being unloving to them.
Question about parenting and having children and not overcoming their free will, and certain circumstantial, like, going to school or making sure their teeth are brushed or those kinds of things. Advice on that.
Well, we've given lots of advice on that.
I think in
And
Canada, I think in Canada we spoke a lot about that.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't know if I want to open that can of worms today, in the sense that there's a lot that could be said about that. But let's just make one comment. A child is your responsibility to educate. Whenever you are permissive in the education, you are teaching the child to take advantage of you and everyone else. When you are also permissive of their behaviour, you're also not teaching them to love themselves. So if I was focused as a parent on educating my child, I would start the process of educating right from the time they're born and right from the time they're in the womb. And I would start the process of educating them emotionally and eventually intellectually, but more emotionally, about what love is, what truth is, what humility is, what faith is. And I would focus my attention on helping them in that regard. Now, if you've done that, by the time they're 7, they're going to be dream children to look after, if you've done that. But for most people, they don't have dream children because by the time they're teenagers, they're in a major fight with mum and dad. Most children nowadays, and we're seeing this more and more in the West in particular, most children have so much permissive behaviour from their parents towards them during their developing years that the children believe they run the whole house by the time they're 3. And they continue that until they're 20. They leave home. Some of them don't leave home until they're 50 because they have that kind of control over their family. So the situation with a child is slightly different in this way. If your child is being unloving, then as an educator, it's your responsibility, since they are living in your house and you have free will, it's your responsibility to educate them how to live with other people and how to educate them to be loving to those people they're living with. Your child has options. Yeah? It has the option to not live with you if it doesn't want to listen to you, or the option to live with you and listen to you, being the fact that you pay for everything in their life. Now, of course, the more the child earns for itself and the more the child becomes more like an adult, then of course the situation starts to change then, doesn't it? And here we're talking about your interaction with adults. Everyone here is an adult. So the guidance I've given you about overcoming a person's free will, that applies as adults. It's something you must do. But if you're educating your child, you would educate your child that they have free will, how that free will is governed by their feelings and also defined to a large degree by the beliefs that they have. And you would educate them how to use that will in a loving manner, and you would have loving laws that correct them for unloving behaviour. Just like God does with you.
So you're still not overcoming the will of the child, but you are providing consequences, just like the law of cause and effect does.
Yeah.
And that's a part of educating. The problem with permissive parenting is there are no consequences. And so the child actually loses connection with the importance and the power of their free will.
Yeah. So, let's get back to the conversation.
But the question behind you, actually.
I guess going back to the comment on how to deal with unwelcome advice.
Yes.
So if I get unwelcome advice, you said to say, I didn't ask for the advice.
Correct. And then if they continue, what do you do?
I guess the thing that comes up for me is when I say that, there's also an emotional charge in it. Sometimes there's an anger. And I don't want to express the anger. How do I express just the words without expressing the anger?
Well, that requires you dealing with some emotion as to what you feel when somebody tries to overcome your will. So this usually is because many of you have injuries associated with your mum and dad, where your mum and dad did try to overcome your will rather than educate you how to use it. They were trying constantly to have you do what they wanted rather than what is truthful or loving. And they also didn't let you make the decision about what is truthful or loving, or educate you about how to do make those decisions, and instead they just try to force their own feelings on you. This is one reason why you feel so upset when somebody else does it. And so you would need to, in another space, not in the space you're in, you'd tell a person, I didn't ask for your advice, go away. And then you come away from that going, I was angry. What am I going to do? There's something wrong inside of me as to why I was angry about it. Like yesterday, many of you tried to overcome my will many, many times. Did I get angry with you about it? But most of you didn't even know that you were even trying to overcome my will while you were doing it, right? And I never got angry with any of you about it. That's because I've felt a lot about people in the past, and particularly in my childhood, trying or attempting to overcome my will. And as a result, I've let go of that grief, and so now I'm not trying to cover over my grief when it happens to me anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so at the moment there might be some anger charge, but I'll work on the anger charge afterwards.
Yeah. So you say the truth, because the truth is you did not ask for the advice. So say it. I didn't ask for this advice. When they continue to say, look, you're being unloving, you need to go away, or I'm going away, one of the two. Obviously, if they're in your home, then they're going to have to go away. If you're in their home, then you're going to have to go away. And that applies whether it's parents or children or, that are not living with you. You would have to go away, right? And so, so a lot of parents feel, because I'm your parent, I have the right to give you unwanted advice, even when the children are like in their 40s. Adults, and that's not true. You don't have that right at all, right? Even God does not do that. So in thinking you have that right, you are even setting yourself above God by doing it. That's how extreme the problem is. You're actually now believing you are God in their life by doing that, right? Something that God doesn't even do, you are doing. So you can see it's a pretty big problem, right? And it's a very big problem in families, very big problem in work situations often, very big problem when you feel you've got to get along with somebody, so those kind of environments are like where you're working for somebody and all you do is listen to the rave on all the time, those kind of things, or all you do is listen to them giving you advice all the time. And for the most part, we don't say that because we're worried about the potential consequences, right? Which is actually a fear that we need to address inside of ourselves, right? So I'm perfectly happy to lose my job if I had to say I didn't ask for your advice and the person sacked me as a result. Now, of course, if they're giving me advice about the job that they're paying for, I couldn't say that, could I? Right? If I'm getting paid to do a job and they're paying me to do a job and I've entered this contract with them saying I'm going to do the jobs you asked me to do, that's the definition of me getting paid for a job. Then when they say, this is how you jump over a stick, I'm going to jump over the stick. But if they told me that I need to walk around the stick to jump over it, then that's what I'm going to do, because I'm getting paid to do the job however they want me to do it, right? I might make a suggestion, a humble suggestion, if I felt there was a faster way, and I'm sure if they're paying me, they'd go, well, a faster way is good, because that means I have to pay you less to get the job done. So, under those circumstances it might be helpful. But if they told me, no, that's wrong, I would always do whatever they want. So I'm cleaning a school, so these things have happened to me all my life. Like I've worked as an electronics engineer, a school cleaner, a window cleaner. I've worked as a systems engineer. I've worked as an educator in the sense of software educator and teaching people how to use software. I've worked as a programmer. I've worked as a systems analyst. There's so many jobs that I've done in the 60 years of my life, and in every case I did exactly what the person asked me to do every time, without complaint, because I had a contract with them. That's what I'm going to by being paid to work. That's what's happening. I've got a contract with them. Now, if you're not in that, having a contract with somebody, then of course it gives you a lot more freedom. So we don't have a contract with you. We paid for this venue, we paid for the seats you're in. Some people helped us, but most of them not you, right? And we paid for a lot of things. We paid to get here. We're not in a contract with you. I can damn well say whatever I like and please. Does that make sense? In the situation, under those circumstances. Now, of course, if I'm loving, I would want to say what's loving, wouldn't I? And what's truthful and what's honest. But if I wasn't loving, I would still be fine from a will perspective that you come into my space, you're going to have to expect to be educated the way I wish to educate you. And if I'm wrong in the way I educate you, then that will come about sooner or later. I'll probably become aware of that. I'll end up with nobody coming to any venue, probably. So there are each circumstance has, you can see quite clearly with each circumstance, it's quite easy to measure what love would do. The problem we have is that most of us don't want to measure it. That's the issue we have. We want to do what we want to do. So let's get back to why I would believe that you must listen to me in a situation where you haven't come to listen to me. Why I have to have a fair degree of arrogance, don't I, under that circumstance, to believe that you should listen to me even though you haven't come to listen to me and you haven't asked to listen to me. I've got to believe that I know better than you. I've got to believe that. And that arrogance needs to be addressed, because that, if I'm willing to be that arrogant that I overcome another person's free will in order to share with them what I think is true, I am so wrong from God's perspective. And actually I'm sinning to one of the largest degrees I could actually sin, because it's the free will from God's perspective is paramount. It is one of the most important gifts he's given to each of you, is your free will. It's paramount to God that that free will is allowed to continue. Now, God has created laws that correct your will, because God created the universe and you live in his house. This is the whole universe is his house and you live in it. So he was allowed to create the laws that govern your life. Now, you don't live like, when you go, I am going to be the lawmaker in my own environment, you are not honouring that you're living in God's house. Right? There's a disrespect there of God immediately. So not only are you disrespecting the will of others, but you're also disrespecting God at the same time. So these are very strong or severe sins that end up affecting your relationship with God. That make sense? Who would you like?
So,
Marianne?
yep, and up the back.
So Marianne on the side and up the back on this side. Yeah. Okay.
So I really struggle with this one, with at home, when and when not to share divine truth.
Yeah.
I want to cry because I know I do it unlovingly.
Yeah. Yeah. Many of times we don't realise that we're misrepresenting God's truth by trying to force it on another person. And our actions are saying, your will isn't important to me, but we're telling them with our words that God says your will is one of the most important gifts you have. You know, so on one hand we're saying to them a concept intellectually, which is your will is the most important thing you can have, and then the other thing we're saying, we're treating them like their will isn't important at all. So they're getting two messages, one with their intellect and one with their emotion. And what we're trying to do under those circumstances is tune them more out of their emotion, which is the opposite thing that God would be doing. He wants them to feel their emotion as well. So this is what was happening yesterday between John and Anna as well. John was trying to tune Anna out of her emotion. She was having emotions that if she lets herself have them, she would actually resolve some issues which would create a tendency towards being open to a closer bond with God. Right? And the man comes along and goes, I don't want you to do that. I want you to understand instead. I want you to understand what I believe is right instead. And in fact, in that place, the man himself is not understanding anything at all about God's principles. Because firstly, he's trying to overcome the will of the person in order to say what he's saying. Secondly, he's being unloving to her while he's trying to tell her about truth. So if she was wise, she wouldn't listen at all. And thirdly, he's also being arrogant in the sense he's saying, I know better than you do about the situation, and unfortunately, it's almost completely the opposite to that. She knows more than he does in the situation because she's more connected emotionally than he is in the situation. And then, of course, on top of that, we're breaking a lot of laws with regard to our arrogance with God. We're doing something that God would not do with the person. And by doing that, we are actually, and in the attempt to try to teach them something that we believe we think we know, we are actually doing a disservice to God's truth under those circumstances.
What I get that a little bit. What I try to do is say more about what I've learned from divine truth, but then if the person doesn't want to, if I say more than a couple of sentences and I can tell if it's not the topic they want, I stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we talk about it?
But even then, it's sort of like,
I know.
I'm really using a manipulative technique.
It is, I agree.
To try to pique their interest in
Exactly.
something they're not interested in yet.
Yeah, I feel like the principles involved are, they relate to free will, humility, and being yourself. So this is because you're not the only person with this question in this room. So the issue is, if part of your job as God's daughter is to be yourself. And
When you say a job.
well, it's part of what God desires for you, and it's something that will bring.
It's not just part of what God desires for you. It's essential for you to be yourself. If you're ever going to be truthful and real in the world, you must be yourself.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't call it a job. I'd call it a necessity. You must be yourself.
I think jobs are necessities. So it's necessary for you to be yourself. And if you love divine truth, then being yourself, you're going to express parts of it all around you all day.
Yeah.
What I see a lot of people struggle in relation to this one is that they're not willing to be themselves with everyone all the time, and then they're like put out a little feeler and say, oh, look, this thing.
Well, I get attacked if I put out this bit of myself.
And then when it isn't well received by their definition, they're like, oh, I'll go back to not being myself. Yep.
Yeah.
So obviously then we're breaking lots of God's laws. So it's not going to work well.
No.
Whereas if you think about a child who's into trains, like my little brother when I was growing up was so into trains. He was just fascinated. He had books and he would talk about trains, but it was it wasn't like forcing it onto someone. He was just in his thing, loving life, enjoying trains. But it was quite engaging because he was thrilled by them. So, when you just be yourself, people are naturally attracted to it. But remember the other principle, free will. You wouldn't be forcing your loves onto other people. See, a lot of us on earth feel like, oh, if I love something, everyone else has to love it, otherwise I'm not allowed to love it. And so then I see other people get real pushy with the people around them, like, I'm into divine truth, you need to be into it, so I feel okay about being into it. And then you're sharing in your so-called passion is actually not about being yourself, it's about trying to overcome the will of others so that you feel more comfortable in what you're doing.
So I think you can avoid your own painful emotion, actually.
Yeah.
So you're actually being selfish.
Yeah. So we've covered being yourself, free will, and humility. If you are humble, you will identify these other two problems. The problem of not wanting to be yourself and the problem of wanting to overcome other people's will. And you will feel about that before you do anything else, or as you do things, you'll go, oh, I can feel that was off. I need to go and look at something inside of myself about why I feel like I know better than other people, or that if they just did divine truth, everything would work out for them. Or why do I feel sad when I'm the only one who's interested in God in my family?
That's what I mostly feel is the grief.
Yeah. Can I stop this conversation now? because now we're getting back to the personal, and there's the ignorance of what Mary just said. So let's just see what Mary just said. What principles did she just say to you? The first principle was?
Be yourself.
Humility.
She said, be self, didn't she? That's a spiritual principle. That is a very high principle.
It's a necessity.
It's a necessity. Every time you're not yourself, you're sinning. Every time. You're sinning against yourself, but you're also sinning against the other people because you're being untruthful with them. You're in a facade. You're presenting a falsity to them. You're out of harmony with truth unless you be yourself. So number one, principle, be self. What was number two? Free will. Important principle. Remember, so Mary listed the principles, and almost every one of you just skipped over it and said, let's get back to the situation. No, if you understood the principle, you wouldn't need to get back to the situation. The principles are the situation. What was the third principle? Humility. Another spiritual principle. Another spiritual principle. 3 spiritual principles. Mary listed them. 1, 2, 3. Really simple for you to understand, right? 3 spiritual principles. But when we hear it, it's like we zone out. We go, but my situation was, stop telling the
story. I want to put them in red and we
story.
just point to them as it happens.
But stop telling the story, because the story is taking you away from the principles. Do you understand me? Right? Every time you tell the story, you're basically justifying not following these principles.
Mine's a special case, sure, but this is the problem for
This is
me.
how it feels for me, this is how it feels for me, this is how it feels. God's saying, no matter how it feels for you, just be humble and feel how it feels for you. That's your feelings. It's not mine, it's not Mary's, it's yours. You need to learn to feel them. That's love. You feeling your own feelings and not forcing any of your feelings on me. That's love. So every single time we tell a story, we're being unloving. Every single time we justify, minimize, shift the blame, and all of these other things that we do about our story, we're also being unloving. But if we focus on the principles, we will solve this problem. And we'll solve it not just only in this situation, but in every situation we live.
If we understand that being myself is a part of truthfulness, it is a part of one of the core principles of God's way, to be myself. If we understand
at all
that,
times.
Whenever I'm in a situation, I think, I wasn't really myself then. I'm sinning. What's my motivation? If we understand that honouring free will, mine and everybody else's, is a crucial part of loving. If we understand that every time we get pushy with someone, or insistent,
or arrogant,
or we sit in a conversation that we don't want to be having, we go, there's my sin.
I'm not honouring either my or somebody else's free will. Right? So, but everyone goes, but what about this tricky situation that I just had last week? And I go, I don't care about your tricky situation you had last week. If you apply these 3 principles, it works for every single situation, tricky or not. Every single time. You see, that the average person goes, but my situation is so tricky.
It's extra tricky.
Right? That it's going to result in being sacked. Or it's going to result in, if I do this, I'll be sacked. Or I have no friends. Or,
I'll be homeless. Some people say I'll be homeless. I'll be destitute. I'll be...
Yeah, so my situation is so tricky that something bad's going to happen, right? And so now that doesn't apply anymore. So please give me some personal advice about that tricky situation.
You want so usually we would say this, and this, but now that you've said that, you want, I'm allowed to sin.
Yeah, basically, I'm allowed to not do these things in my tricky situation.
You want the special, it could be that. Oh no, I'm allowed to sin.
Yeah. And all we're trying to do basically is say, but none of that really applies to my tricky situation. I've got to sin in my tricky situation, is really what we're saying. I've got to do the wrong thing in my tricky situation, right? Because my tricky situation is so tricky. You have no understanding how tricky my tricky situation is, right? This is sort of what we're thinking. We're thinking that we're somehow, the law is unique, should be unique for us, right? And we think, you know, the way we're thinking is like, I'm special, my situation is special. It's different than all these little things you talk about, Jesus. Like, it's not like a little thing, like, you know, I might lose my family if I do what you said, and I might lose my friends if I do what you said, and I might lose my job if I do what you said. And actually, you know, every time you talk about vegan diet, I might lose my health and I might die if I do what you said. And you know, so my situation is unique. This is how we think, right? And that's because we don't understand the power of the principles. Make sense?
So we don't mind you bringing up situations, but when we respond with principles, a lot of you, tune out of that.
You've got these sort of like switches in your ears that just go, principle? It reminds me of that sort of show, what was it? You know, the antennas come up like...
My favourite Martian.
My favourite Martian. Like,
Yeah.
For us it's like, you know...
The antenna's down.
The antenna's there.
Yeah.
You know, like not listening anymore because it's now not applicable to my situation anymore, right? Is what we think. And these principles, the reason why they're so important for your life is they apply to every situation. Little ones and big ones. Little ones and tricky ones. Things that are difficult that might have outcomes that you don't want or are unprepared for, even. You see, we live in a world that does not reward love. It rewards addiction. So when you live in a world that rewards addiction, when you do something that's in harmony with love and not in harmony with addiction, you might even be punished for it. But if you love these principles, you'll be okay with that. Mary and I get so many abusive emails, so many abusive people talking to us, all sorts of things, death threats. You know, on the average we probably get, well, depends whether the media is involved, because if the media is involved, we get over 1,000 death threats from every media show that's ever done generally, right? And we get all sorts of threats, rape Mary and all sorts of stuff, right, happening, because we want to be loving and be self and, you know, honour people's free will, but be humble, and we want to do these things. Now, if that's what it's like for us, don't you think you might have a bit of that yourself? Well, of course you're going to have, because the world is not in a place where it rewards love. It rewards addiction. It rewards unloving behaviour. You know this. This is one reason why many of you want to continue to be unloving, because you feel it rewards unloving behaviour, right? You know this. And God's laws do not. God's laws correct unloving behaviour. And what I've personally found throughout our entire lives, that if we live in harmony with the principles of love, then things work out for the best in the long term. And that's not just the best for you, it's also the best for me. You know, one of the reasons why there are great rewards for a person who gets punished on earth for unloving things is, when I say that, what I mean is they get, punished on earth for doing loving things. There's great rewards in the spirit world for a person who puts up with that. Great rewards. Yeah? So these principles are extremely important. So let's come back to Mary Ann's situation. So when you examine these situations, imagine for a moment that your emotions are not involved.
Okay. With the sharing.
With the sharing. Let's say you're not worried about what they think of you anymore. You're also not worried about having to share something that you think is so important for their life but they don't think is important at all. Let's say you feel that, you know, you can see their life heading towards a disaster, but you don't feel like you have to rescue them from it. let's say, right?
Because you're humble.
Because you're humble.
You felt about those things.
Yep. So imagine there is literally no emotion in you about having to present the truth to another person. You don't feel like you have to, but you also would like to. Right?
And part of being yourself
Is that you want to, right?
because it's a part of what
But
you love.
imagine that you don't want to overcome their will ever, and you're so sensitive that you can even feel when they don't want to listen to you. They don't even have to say it.
Yeah.
You can just feel it, let's say, that they don't want to hear. And let's say you're so humble that no matter how they treat you, you know you're going to cope with any emotion you have. So let's say all that's true. Can you see in that situation, you don't care what you're going to feel?
Yeah.
At all. You don't worry about what you're going to have to feel. You know you can handle whatever it is. Right?
And you don't really care how they receive it either.
No, if they get angry, you don't worry about that. But if they're sad, you don't worry about that either. And if they feel all guilty, you don't worry about cheering them up from that either. And if they feel like just bitter with you for the rest of their life, you go, fair enough. You don't feel like, that it's all unfair that they've done that to you either. Because they have free will. They're allowed to do any of those things. God's laws, of course, will correct a lot of that behaviour. But you're one of God's children. You're not able to correct their behaviour. The law will. Yeah? So imagine you felt all that. Can you see, when you go into any situation, you wouldn't be worried, would you? You wouldn't be concerned about how to share the truth. You'd just be yourself, honour their free will, be humble to any feeling you have, see what happens, and you just move on from one situation to the next situation to the next situation. We have a lovely sister in Australia. Eloisa is her name. She runs God's Way. And this is what she's like now. She says, every situation, she goes to school, picks up the kids, the headmaster comes out, starts talking about why her kids are so lovely behaved, and she goes, well, it wasn't like that. When I was in, when the kids were 2, they were like nightmares. They used to be the kids who destroyed the supermarket and all that stuff. And then that gives the headmaster, well, how did everything change? Because that's why we got a lot of problem here with all the kids doing that. Well, it was all about divine truth. And what I learned was that I had to have free will. I had to honour the free will, but I also had to educate my children, and I learned all these things about children. She's even now put, I think Mary put a link to it on her blog, a little program to help parents come to terms with all those things, right? And almost everybody Eloisa talks to asks her about truth at some point.
Yeah. And she has I tease her, I say, no filter. Because she just talks about spirits,
She's
the
just herself
headmaster.
all the time.
She talks about, what happens with after you die to the dozer driver. She talks about emotions with, the other mum at the school.
And when the dozer driver doesn't want to follow her instructions, she says, you have a lot of trouble listening to a woman, don't you? Like,
What's your relationship with your
What's going on? What's going on with your mum? Like, why is that? Like that kind of thing. And they get all involved in the conversations. They do.
And some of them don't, but Elle just moves on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very rare that they don't.
It's rare.
Rare.
It's rare.
Yeah.
At least to have the conversation.
Yeah.
It's very rare.
Yeah. And then they go, they might even go later, they might go, don't go there to her. Don't be a dozer driver there, she'll just lecture about something sooner or later. And sometimes the dozer driver comes, after a while, he comes and he sits in his car the whole time he has a break, rather than talk to her. Because, but that's okay, Eloise's fine with that too.
And she's not forcing it on them, but she's being herself. So if she doesn't agree, she doesn't go,
But if she's paying the dozer driver, then he's got to listen to what she has to say.
Her instructions
her
and
about
how she wants the
instructions,
job
right?
done.
Yeah.
But also, she doesn't, in a social situation, she doesn't just politely agree or go, it could be another way. She says, I
No, I don't agree with that.
Yeah, it's actually like this.
Yeah.
So that's not forcing it on anyone, but she's just being herself.
You don't have to agree with people. It's not honouring your will to agree with others when you don't agree with them. It's also not being yourself when you agree with others when you don't really agree with them. It's not being yourself either. So you're breaking, and also you're not being humble enough to just be yourself and take what comes, right? So you're already breaking the principles
A lot of us are measuring other people, aren't we? Thinking, how much can I be myself with this person?
Yeah, what can I get away with?
Which is breaking the law.
Yeah, yeah. So if you just be these things, it makes your life simple, makes it easy to address. Every situation becomes applicable to every situation. Now, Eloisa has learnt that. I've learnt that. When are you going to learn it? Make sense?
Yes.
The more you learn it, the happier you're going to be. And the more content you will be. The easier you'll find your life. You'll attract friends who like you being this way. Right? Initially it might not be many, but after a while it'll be many. I've got millions of friends. Yeah.
And you know what? You'll sleep better too. I know that sounds funny, but you will.
You won't
If
be
you
anxious.
if you deal with being yourself in your everyday life and you feel whatever comes up, you're going to sleep like a
Baby.
a peaceful baby. Some babies don't sleep that well.
Like a log.
Yeah,
Like
like
a
a
log,
log.
yeah.
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 That's because you're dealing with your life.
But every time we say to ourselves, these principles don't apply to my situation, what we're now doing is we're now justifying acting out of harmony with the principle for my situation. When we do that, we're automatically sinning. Because every time we break one of these principles, we are sinning. There's going to be a penalty on our soul for taking such action. Every time I break one of those principles. These principles, there are so many laws that are all about the principle. Like just being self. There's truth-based laws about being self. There's love-based laws about being self. There's humility-based laws about being self. There's faith-based laws about being self. And so when you stop being yourself, you're breaking all those laws, all together. And every one of the laws has a penalty. So you might be breaking hundreds of laws by just not being yourself. And every one of them is going to have a penalty in your life. So some of the penalties, many of you are already experiencing, where people don't know you. And you sometimes lay awake at night and go, well, I don't know if anybody really knows me in my entire life. Well, that's one of the penalties of you not being yourself. Yeah?
And sometimes you lie in bed and go, I don't know who I am. That's another
That's one of the penalties of not being yourself.
When you're fake with people continually for years and years and years, you lose touch with who
you
am
are.
I actually.
Yeah, that's another penalty. And they're big penalties because they're human soul-based penalties. Now, later in the day, we would start raising human soul-based beliefs and how they affect us, right? And maybe that might be tomorrow morning because there's a few other things we want to talk about God yet. But we wanted to raise these issues with you now because you can see that every time we believe that a principle doesn't apply in my situation, we are automatically going to sin. It's automatic. Every time I believe a spiritual principle does not apply for me.
The question we need to be asking ourselves all day, every day, is how does this principle apply right now? How does it apply to me? How does it apply to this situation? That's how we come to really get God's way in our heart. Because otherwise it's just like a nebulous concept. We think, oh yeah, truth, love, humility, that all sounds good. But unless we're applying those principles every single day to our every single situation, we won't really understand what they mean from God's perspective.
Yeah. So you know, Mary and I speak often, don't you, about love, truth, humility, faith, taking action, right? Being self, you don't do, if you choose to not be yourself, you're breaking every one of those principles. Every time you do it. Right? If you choose to not engage somebody's free will or your own, you're doing it every time. You're breaking all of the principles every single time. Every single time you don't honour somebody's free will. This is why I'm saying they're such big sins. They'll have a big effect on your life, right? Every time you lack humility, you're going to be breaking so many laws. You're not going to be living in harmony with truth. You're not going to be loving to other people. You're not even going to be loving to yourself. Right? And you certainly demonstrate that you don't have faith in humility as a principle.
And you can't grow faith.
And you can't grow faith
because
without humility.
Yeah.
So principles are the key for your future. They are more important than your stories. And this is why a lot of times when you start telling your stories, you say it's a story. You know, in one assistance group, we had cards. We made up cards.
I'm going to emulate them here.
Yeah. So we made up cards, and one of them like had story, and Mary would every time somebody started to tell a story, she'd hold up a card, and we wouldn't say anything. We'd just hold up the card, right? And then every time somebody started to justify something, hold up that card. Every time they tried to minimise it, hold up that card. After a while, everyone started getting used to the idea. Oh, here I go again. Here I go again. Here I go again. Doing my thing, which is taking me away from the principles in terms of my day-to-day life. So when you come to our next year, we're thinking when we do a trip around, we'll probably do some sort of discussion about sin, right? As a sort of an assistance group, short assistance group, 3 days or 4 days about sin. And who knows, we might have our cards back then. So every time we do one thing that's out of harmony with the principle, we can if we can highlight to you the dangers of these things and how they take you away from wanting to do these things, then you can see a lot of areas where you're then sinning and therefore are going to have future problems in your life as a result.
One final point about sharing divine truth. If you honour these principles, if you live by these principles when you share divine truth,
and not just these, also others.
Yeah, all the principles we teach. But, you know, if you be yourself, you honour free will, and you're very humble about your motivations and deal with the unloving ones, that is extremely attractive to people. When you're out of harmony with them, it's very repellent, which is why a lot of you feel like, oh, it doesn't work when I talk about it. But if you live in harmony with these things and be yourself in relation to divine truth, it's very attractive to people. People can feel from a soul perspective when you're not honouring their free will, or when you're invested for something in yourself, or when you're being kind of fake, or you're not being fully transparent. Yeah.
Very true. Thank you.
All right. Now we're at the back, I think.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about the, I didn't ask for your advice part, which there are so many familial and societal beliefs tied up in that. Like, you know, at least India, growing up in India again, every well-meaning adult has an opinion on something, you know. It is so difficult for a child growing up to be aware of the extent to which their will has been impacted upon.
Correct.
So
And can we call them well-meaning?
Sorry?
They're
Can
not
we
really
call them
well-meaning.
well-meaning?
You're saying they're well-meaning adults, and I'm saying no,
they're not well-meaning.
they're self-interested adults.
Yes, and so, you know, to fit into that society, you have to conform. And as you said earlier on...
No, you don't.
No, I agree, you don't. As you said, that's one of the commonest addictions we struggle with, the need to belong, the need to, you know, conform.
Correct.
And
It's an addiction, though.
yes, because what you just said, Mary, about, you know, when you follow those principles, divine truth is very attractive, is absolutely true.
Yeah.
I mean, as a physician, I share it with everybody.
Yeah.
And when I started sharing it, referring physicians would no longer refer to me because one of them called and told my nurse practitioner, she's talking about God. So my nurse practitioner came to me and said, Vijaya, what are you doing? You're going to run your practice into the ground. So I said, that's okay. You can leave if you want.
Yeah.
This is where I'm going. And that was in 2016.
I'm talking about God because God's real.
and that was in 2016.
Yeah. So you're still going 8 years later.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now I sit there and I'm talking to patients every day, and I go home and I say, wow, what a lovely life I have. I actually talk about God all day long to people.
To every patient.
And I have absolutely no problem, and they're listening. Nobody has called me a quack or anything of that nature.
Yeah.
As long as you said those 3 principles were.
And it's very interesting when you're a professional like that because they are coming to you. So now the situation is you're allowed to share what you know, what you believe you know is truth with others. Of course, you've got to be careful that it is true. So that's the only thing you have to take care of. But aside from that, as long as you do it in a loving manner, looking, you know, with their free will engaged, but the fact is they're visiting you for advice specifically. Like, how great an opportunity is that?
It is. It's miraculous. And I do present them the options, and I say, I could treat you this way, but I choose to recommend you do this. And if you still want it, I'll give it to you, no problem. And I actually tell them, I say, I'm not being honest with myself if I write you a prescription or give you something I shouldn't give you, because...
See, I would have a problem with that. So that's an area where I would have a problem. So example is, if you look at almost all medication nowadays, it all has a purpose. And a lot of the purposes is to distract people from their true condition. Now, I would have a problem prescribing something to a person when I know the purpose the person is using it for is to distract them from their own condition. Now, this is something that, so you saying to people, I will treat you this way or that way, in other words, you're saying, I'll treat you the way you want, or treat you the way I feel you should be treated, and they make a choice, well, that's not really loving to you, or to God, by the way, because they're God's child, and they're wanting to be treated a certain way, which is out of harmony with what you know to be love. Now, under those circumstances, I couldn't assist the person, right? Whereas you're able to. So there's something to look at there. Does that make sense? And I know that requires even more bravery.
Yes, I would have to give up my license, because when I'm in the hospital, it's very hard. It's very disheartening, because all we're doing is keeping people alive so that they can go back and do exactly the same thing that got them in trouble in the first place.
Yes.
And so I struggle with this constant,
I understand, but it's interesting what you just said, isn't it? I'd have to give up my license. What? Can you see? Basically, it's going. Okay, if I'm so truthful and I'm so in line with God on the matter, if I go too far, then certain things will happen to me that I don't want to have happen to me. I might lose my livelihood. I might lose my joy, doing what I currently do, because people restrict me. So this is like, I understand where you're at with it, and I understand the pressures you're under. We know, and a couple of other doctors who have the same pressures. But if I was truly in harmony with God on the matter myself, I would not be able to enable you to treat yourself, with my help, treat yourself in a way that's out of harmony with the way God feels you should be treated. And so you've got to be very careful about then going, but I'm honouring their free will, but you're actually dishonouring God's laws at the same time. So you've got to be careful of that choice, you see. And a lot of times it's because we're afraid that something will then happen to us. So loss of my livelihood, my welfare might happen to me, or something like that.
My status? Sometimes.
My status, my respect, the respect in the community, other things like that we often look for as well, you see. And so I agree with what you're saying to that point, but once we hit that point, I can no longer agree. The reason why I can no longer agree is because I can't, if I am doing something with a person which is actually not what God would wish me to do with the person, then even though it's what they want, I personally would not be able to do it, right? So let's say Mary wanted me to, I don't know, ideas are hard sometimes to come up with because they're so far removed from where I am now. What do you want me to do, babe? Agree with your dad being taking advantage of people, let's say.
In business or
in
something,
business.
say.
Let's say I know that Mary's dad takes advantage of people. Mary knows, and she wants me to just like her dad, even though he's taking advantage of people. Every time I saw her dad, I'd have to say something. You're taking advantage of people. This is wrong. And every time, and particularly not so much her dad, but Mary in particular, if Mary wanted me to accept her dad doing that, I could not. I can love your dad, I can treat him nicely, but I cannot accept that he does this thing. And if her dad offered us money from his dodgy business deals, I would not be able to take it. I would not. So this is like, sometimes I've known that people have given us donations, but they got it from drugs. We said no. We can't take that. We can't take that. And they say, but it will be used for something good. I say, you use it to fix up your problem as to why you're destroying people's lives, right? Rather than giving the money to me, you use it to fix up all the dangerous things that you're doing with people. You do something about that. I don't want anything to do with that money. It's tainted money. Tainted in the sense that it's tainted because it's involving the destruction of people's lives, one way or the other. You know as a doctor that many things like antidepressants are destructive to people's lives. Yeah. And you know that if they will come to you asking for them even, because they want a medical solution to what is fundamentally an emotional problem they don't wish to address. Under those circumstances, I would say to them, you're going to have to see a different doctor than me.
That I do. I don't prescribe antidepressants. So.
Yeah, so I'm just giving you an example. Yeah, so we have to be very firm about the principles, and that implies in all aspects of life. Yeah? And aside from that, I agree with what you said.
And I had a question about truth, the principle of truth.
Yep.
Truth is the framework under which love operates. Truth is the framework of the universe that allows the principle of love to operate, is what I've heard, or maybe what I understood before.
Yes, if you think about it though, the framework, I see it more personal than that. So the way I see it is the framework that God's created, which are God's laws, and all of God's laws are God's statement of truth, aren't they? So all of the laws are God stating, this is what I feel is the truth, not what Jesus feels is the truth, what God feels is the truth. So you could say that the laws themselves, which create the structure, are what God feels. Now, what God feels is a combination of love, truth, wisdom, power, knowledge, and a number of other factors, right? There are many, in fact, qualities that God has that are incorporated in her laws. So to me, it's just not about truth only, and it's not that it's about creating a framework for love. It's about the fact that it's God's personality or nature is creating the framework, and all of God's personality and nature is expressed in the framework, of which love is one of the qualities expressed in the framework. Truth is another, which are two very much joined together qualities, but so are other qualities such as wisdom, power, what I would call understanding, like emotional-based understanding. Like God understands what God created, and so every part of God's nature and personality is in what God created and is in the framework of the creation. That makes sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
The reason I asked that question is, to me, particularly when I'm talking to some of my more intellectually developed friends, I'm trying to explain that absolute truth must exist, because if absolute truth did not exist, you could not measure deviance from that absolute truth. Correct. Which is exactly how sin is measured in God's laws.
But ironically, it's even how physical devices are created, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, for instance, other doctor friends, I'm like, you respect the laws that govern the heart. I mean, you're not asking questions about that. So why do you have this issue of absolute truth? Yeah. It has to be absolute because there's no other way. If you were a creator, you could create a system where everything can be measured in deviance. There has to be a certainty. So that's, am I misspeaking when I say that?
No, that's very, very true. Very true. And you have a good understanding of many of the truths. The difficulty you have is feeling the understanding. You have a very good, because you've got a good mind, you have a good understanding of the truths intellectually. But when it comes to actually feeling them, this is where there is a struggle. So an example of that is when you came up to Mary to try to correct her on Saturday prior, you know the event I'm talking to, you were actually breaking the principle of free will. So without really understanding, you were breaking a fundamental law. Now, that indicates that the emotion that was driving you was not a loving emotion, because you were prepared to break the fundamental principle. And Mary tried to raise that with you in the conversation to a degree, but you always were feeling like, no, I've got to correct it. You know, Mary, have you got the bad attitude with me type of feeling that you were having, not understanding that in the expression of the correction, you were having the unloving attitude. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now that indicates that the emotion driving the feelings about that belief aren't there.
About the principle.
About
the
the
principle's
principle.
not yet in your soul.
It's not in your soul. You have an intellectual sort of understanding and grasp of it in terms of the logic of it all, which is fine. There is a lot of logic, and as doctors, you're taught often to be very logical, aren't you? Because you're constantly tracing causes from effects. You know, you're always going. You see the effect, and you're trying to trace from the effect the cause of the problem. So this causes you to have a very logical understanding of things. But you've got to be careful about still seeing and analysing your own behaviour and going, oh, this means the fact that I was willing to break it with that requirement means that I don't really grasp what it feels like yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
I would caution you in your practice about that, because there'll be the tendency, so
To use your mind.
yes, but to influence people's free will, even when you're telling yourself, I'm respecting it, there'll be a tendency, and
Yeah.
because
You were willing to do it with Mary, so you're obviously going to be willing to do it with others who come to you for advice.
yeah,
That makes sense, doesn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and I regressed heavily. I felt violently ill on Tuesday, and
Yeah.
you know, for 2 days just flat out on the bed.
Yeah.
Because I was so sick, and I realized I regressed to that, you know.
Well, I don't know if it's a regression, you see.
No, you're right.
We're saying the same things. And a lot of times we think that when we get sick that it means that I regressed, or when we get... No, a lot of times you're coming to terms with something that you haven't come to terms with before. And oftentimes at the beginning of coming to terms with something, there is often a physiological response and even sickness that may result as a part of the process of coming to terms with the thing. And a lot of people get very judgmental about sickness, but actually sickness is often an indication that you're now more sensitive to something that you weren't sensitive to before. The sickness is indicating you're still fighting it, but the fact that you're having the sickness means you're more sensitive to the fight. Whereas before you were just in the fight and you didn't get sick at all. You know what I mean? So don't presume that just because you're getting sick now or going through a process that's physical, that it means you regressed. No, what it often means is that you're coming to terms with something and there's still resistance, emotional resistance to the truth of the matter inside of the feelings of yourself. And then there is going to be, because of the resistance, there are going to be physical and psychological responses to the fight that's going on. And these psychological and physical responses can often cause you to get sick while you're trying to deal with something for that reason. So very important to not judge that process so much. Because you're used to having such a strong mind, you're very often judging yourself for your responses to what's going on. And if you've got that tendency yourself, there's going to be that tendency that actually is also on your patients to judge what's happening with them as well. So very important to see that actually sometimes you have all sorts of responses. So an example of that is you work through a bit of fear and your feet will start smelling for a while and your hands will smell for a while and you'll get itchy scalp probably, and there's all sorts of other things that might happen while you're working through the problem. And then when you resolve it, the smelly feet and the itchy scalp and all that just go away. You know what I mean? And the reason why they came while you were going through the feeling is because there was some resistance to the feeling, which is usually quite normal for most people. If there was no resistance, they would have gone through the feeling many years ago, most probably. And so just have a more loving approach to the concept of physical illness resulting from dealing with things.
Yeah, and sometimes when we raise something or something gets exposed in our life, things get stirred up, and as Jesus said, sometimes we're more sensitive, but also the resistance is highlighted and it causes physical stresses in the body and you get unwell. But the worst thing you can do at that point is to become judgmental with yourself, because really the best thing at that moment is compassion with self and more seeking, more curiosity.
Yeah.
Okay, what is it that I'm resisting? Why am I resisting? Why did that feel
This
bad?
is indicating that I am now resisting something I'm more conscious of.
What is it that
What
just got
is it?
exposed
Yeah.
and those kinds of things? So,
Yeah, I do want to say that I meant by addressing our interaction brought up some very intense emotions that were very, very old, that I was insensitive to before this.
Yeah, and that's why it's great to have interactions when we're truthful, because these things do get exposed.
And also in the process where the sensitivity is growing, you will find that's when you're prone to sickness as well, right? Because you're still an internal battle going on with the disagreement between you becoming more sensitive to the problem and you just detuning from the problem instead. And so during those times our body systems are more likely to get ill because of the disharmony between what we feel and in terms of what's stored in us and our awareness in terms of what we would like to have stored in us. So there's a big disharmony there, and usually that results in a lot of issues psychologically as well as emotionally that can cause illness of some kind or other. And this happens to me all the time. It's always temporary.
Yeah. So along those lines, I have always wanted to ask, so I see pain as a feedback signal, as you yourself have said, a very good feedback signal to tell you that there's something out of harmony. People walk in, let's say, with cancers, large tumors, that, you wonder how it grew to that size and they had no awareness that it was there.
Can we say what's out of harmony though? It's a spiritual principle that's out of harmony that creates these problems.
The pain, yeah.
So the journey back from that state to actually feeling the emotion, I would think logically one of the steps would be that now starts to hurt, where it didn't hurt before. Would that be reasonable to assume or not necessarily?
Well, just because a person doesn't have physical pain, it doesn't mean, in the sense that they're not aware of it, it doesn't mean they don't have it, as you well know, right? You know that people are often very detuned from even their own bodies, their own sense of touch and their own sense of feelings. Even their sensory apparatus of their body, they're frequently detuned from, completely sometimes. This is particularly the case with sexual matters too, very often completely detuned from their body. And so you can see, firstly, that denial causes complete detunement. And during the stage of complete detunement, often things like a tumour can grow because they're engaging addiction where they're breaking a major principle. And the tumour will grow, and the location it grows will be where the principle is being broken. And so the tumour may grow, but because of their lack of personal sensitivity even to their own body functions and pain, they don't notice it for a long time. Many people don't notice things for a long time. You know, people, as you know, can have blisters and all sorts and not even really feel the pain of them, even though it's quite obvious there must be some. So there's a detunement that extends beyond the emotional into the physical, that you can actually teach yourself to detune from your physical pains. And the average person on earth does this quite extensively, right? But that all being said, the emotions which drive the avoidance of emotion drives the physical sickness of whatever it is, the malady. Let's call it the malady. but the emotions that drive it are caused by false beliefs. So, it's a sort of an interesting process with most sickness, because you've got the false beliefs, which are the primary cause, transferring themselves into the emotional state which the person then wishes to deny, which then transfers it into a physical state which is exhibiting itself in the physical body. Right? Now, you can resolve the emotion and the physical disappear, but the belief will keep generating the emotion. So unless the belief is actually dealt with, there is no real cure. Does that make sense? And this is what most people who hear divine truth, they go, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm just going to deal with that. Not understanding that actually the emotion is really in a lot of ways an effect as well of the false belief being present, right? And the false belief drives the emotion, and that then drives the physical illness. So when you're a physician, and this is where it's difficult, isn't it? Because in like the world's view of medicine is that you have an area of expertise, isn't it? Like, so I'm a cancer specialist, or I'm a specialist of the heart, or whatever. But the reality is that every physician really needs to come to learn to have be a belief specialist as well. In the long run, that's where we need to go. And this is where, as you know, it's hard enough to convince a person to just feel them emotions, right? But to actually help them feel their beliefs is even more difficult. But this is, if we want to have a true healing of people's physical ailments on earth, this is where we need to head. Into becoming aware of what beliefs are causing certain emotions, which then cause certain actions, which then cause certain physical ailments. And the beautiful thing about it, though, from God's perspective, is every single malady is of one type is always linked to a belief of one type. And it's always linked to an emotion of one type. And the beautiful thing about that is it's all traceable scientifically. So if there was more research done in this area, we would be able to solve all sorts of problems. Cancers, all sorts of other problems that we view as significant on Earth are actually not as significant in terms of solving them as we believe they are. Right? So the reason why I wanted to say all that is that I wanted to focus that it's the belief that is the problem. So when you raise the issue of cancer, for example, someone coming along with a huge tumour and they're not even aware they even have it, well, that's because they're so detuned even physically from their own senses that they can't even feel they have a problem until it's huge and affecting them in lots of different physiological manners. But if they were sensitive to the emotion, the physical thing would not have ever occurred. But if they were sensitive to the belief, the emotion would not have even occurred. And this is why we need to eventually get back to there.
And where's the causal emotion we would refer to before? Because
the causal emotion is a belief that drives their expression of their emotions in one way or the other, or their suppression of emotions in one way or the other.
It's like a governing.
It's the governing principle
aspect of a system.
Yeah.
The false belief,
Yeah.
or the pure belief. It governs what you do emotionally and how you respond to emotion, how you respond to situations,
Yeah.
How you perceive things.
So let's say an example. I've got a cancer. Let's say the cancer is in my cervix, right? There's emotions to do with the satisfying of men's sexual desires that I feel that I must do without complaint in order to have that cancer. Does that make sense? But that's driven by a belief about my relationship with men and what I need to get from men and how to get those things from men and what I need to do to get those things from men. And they are all driven by spiritual beliefs, things that I believe that I need to do in order to get sexual approval from men, right? So I can deal with the emotion of where I'm willing to give out sexual energy to men in order to get this return feeling that I'm a good girl, a nice girl, a good woman, you know. I can deal with all of that, and the cancer will actually be cured, but the cause of it won't be yet. Because the actual cause is my beliefs that I should continue doing it. Yeah? And this is so I will be prone for it to recurring if I don't deal with the actual belief. Yeah.
And the other aspect of your question about, like, if I'm detuned from physical pain, as I become more sensitive emotionally, will physical pain also arise? Very often. But
because you go through a period, don't you, of discovery.
Yeah.
And in that period you've got resistances, and you've got, and the resistance has often become more intense. And therefore the physical symptoms might become more intense during that phase. Yeah.
And if you can't be sensitive to physical pain, then you're definitely not going to be sensitive to emotional pain.
Yeah.
And the last thing I've always wanted to ask you was not something we spoke about here today, but masculinity and femininity. You've always promised to talk about what true masculinity and true femininity.
Yeah, we'll get around to it.
I want to express more pure femininity.
Yeah. We'll get around to it, but to be honest, we need to focus on the principles for both genders first, and both before we can start looking at how they may be expressed in terms of a feminine way of expressing it versus a masculine way of expressing it.
And the very cool thing is that if you're a feminine half of the soul, if you live by God's principles, you will express femininity. Yeah. Pure femininity. And if you're a man, if you live by God's principles, you will express pure masculinity. So the danger that we've often discussed about discussing, well, this is a feminine thing, this is a masculine. If nobody's
people start trying to do it.
Yeah, if nobody's humble, if nobody's actually sensitive, then they try to emulate those things, or they don't really understand those things. So I think the best thing rather than discussion would be a demonstration.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I love what Albert Einstein, he called you a spiritual genius.
Well, thanks for Albert, yes. Yeah. I know, we know Albert fairly well, so, yes, but I'm not the genius. God is.
Yeah.
And all I've done is learn from God what God's done. Yeah. Michael?
I would like to ask a question from a spirit's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening, so the short story is I was listening to you talk about parenting, and I became aware that a spirit was saying, he's a man, he doesn't know anything. So I said, hold on and wait and listen to what he's saying.
Yeah.
And so I'm
so
aware...
that was a woman spirit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I wasn't asking for her input,
No.
but she gave it to me.
Yeah.
But I might have had an emotional openness or attraction to it.
Oh, you're very open, or I would say you're very demanding that women have engagement with you all the time. And so women spirits often respond to that demand. Yeah. But go on.
So from us, how could...
You got to sort of pause on that one, don't you? Right? Can you see sometimes it's like, oh yeah, oh, like, I've got to think about that.
I wasn't bargaining on that when I picked up this microphone.
But far away.
Yeah.
So we get a lot of input from spirits listening to you.
We do, yeah.
What responsibility, what could they consider? Because they can see we may not be asking for their input, but we may be emotionally wanting it.
Correct. And when you're emotionally wanting input, the spirits can easily share packages of thoughts with you, plus their feelings with you as well. And this frequency happens. This was happening yesterday for many of you in the group, which is one reason why we thought we need to communicate with some of the spirits that were influencing you in order to lighten the sort of pushy burden that was on you. Many of them were giving you advice without you thinking you were asking for it. But remember, asking is not a word thing, is it? Asking it is an emotional thing, isn't it? So many of you are asking for advice from spirits, even though you think you're not.
Or you're seeking spirit's approval or attention,
Yep.
and then you get advice from them that you maybe weren't seeking, but you were seeking their company.
Yeah. And a lot of times you're seeking their addiction with you. And so that then makes you prone to being able to have things shared with you, their thoughts. So what happens is, let's say you're seeking an addiction. You remember in Canada, you said, what was your addiction that you mentioned that you think was really, really nice?
That was about women nursing men?
That's right. That's
the
right.
sexy mummy, I said.
Mary said.
Yeah, most guys want a sexy mummy, someone who will mother them but also be sexy.
Yeah, so mother and be sexy with them, and you said, oh yes, that's wonderful. You don't remember that?
No.
That's exactly what you said. And so.
And I said, Mike, no.
And Mary said, Mike, no. You know, and this was during the presentation. If you listen to it, you'll remember.
Okay.
Now, so this is what you want from a woman. You want to be mothered, but you also want some sexual attraction from her, so that you can feel good about yourself sexually as well. So if you want those things, and a woman there are plenty of women in the spirit world too who are willing to come along and give you those things. So the spirit comes along, the spirit gives you the feeling, I will mummy you a bit, you know, I'll nurse you. So I'll nurse you, but I'll also make you feel like sexually you're great. And even sometimes they'll participate in any sexual activity you have, whether it's with a partner or by yourself, right? They'll even participate in that with you to make you feel good, right? So you're basically having a mother and a sexual relationship with this spirit. Now, let's say this spirit has a lot of ideas that are in disharmony with truth, but they're her ideas. So one of her ideas is, men have no idea how to look after children. Men don't have to be pregnant with them. They don't know what it's like to be a mother. They don't know how much you need to be a mother. They don't understand these feelings. But that's what she's saying.
And most mothers historically have raised children. They have gotten up in the night, they have changed nappies.
They've done all the hard work.
They've done all the hard work of child rearing.
So she has all these ideas. They're all her personal ideas. But this bond you have with the spirit then causes you to be open to accepting her ideas when she says them. So this is the addiction that causes the binding between yourself and the spirit. But now you're also potentially open to all of her thoughts as well through that binding. Does that make sense? Because if you don't open yourself to her thoughts, then she'll no longer want to nurse you. So now we've got a thing of like, I've got to be open to her thoughts. Because if I'm not, and she decides she's not going to nurse me anymore, then I won't have that feeling from her anymore, and that's my addiction. I need that feeling, and so I would rather put up with the fact that she's got all these thoughts coming at me as well, some of which you can intellectually see must be false, but others of which you're just going to feel they were your own thoughts and act upon them. Yeah.
So, what should a person do, Jake? They're in the audience and they notice this ideas coming from spirits to their mind.
Yep.
What would be the course of action?
So the problem isn't the ideas really coming to you, are they? They're not the problem. They're the effect of the problem. The real problem is the personal addictions you have with the spirit. That's the real problem. There's a personal addiction you have, and the key is to work through the personal addictions. In case of yourself, Mike, you know you want to be mothered and you want to have that sexual feeling, so you want to be nursed, in other words, and you also want to be approved of sexually by women. So you're always looking to interact with women, to give you a sexual feeling of some kind. You're not necessarily interested in having sex with them, but really it is a sexual interaction. So from God's perspective, you're having sex with them. Right? This is what I meant in the first century when I said, even the man who looks at a woman as to desire her is committing adultery with her. Right? And this is often happening between the spirit and the person on earth. So these ideas coming at you are going to be just the spirit's ideas coming at you. Now, You have to deal with the reason why the connection exists. And that's all about Michael's personal sin, which is his personal addiction. His addiction is the sin. And at the moment, Michael says, right, so you did say this in Canada, wow, yeah, give me that, right? So in other words, the feeling is, this is good for me. This feels good for me. But,
and you're not alone, Michael.
And you're not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are many, many men in this situation. In fact, many men are living with women in this situation. Where
Many women are trying to be this.
At the same time,
They're
which is
trying
very
to be
difficult.
sexy mothers with men in order to find a
Yeah, and
partner.
they're even trying to be the mother of the men they're living with, as well as the sexual partner of the men they're
They
living with
are.
at the same time.
It's
in many
the
cases.
ideal woman for most men, so
Yeah.
most women are trying for it.
Yeah. And this nursing women, this is also the reason why many men like women with bigger breasts, for example, and other things like that, or feel very attracted to breasts and things like that, because they like the nurturing, the idealization of the nurturing. So there's a lot of addiction in there, and that addiction then makes it you're very open for that spirit's ideas. In other words, you're not just accepting the emotion from the spirit anymore. You're accepting the intellectual concepts the spirit still has as well at the same time, right? But that's just an effect. You could say the acceptance of these ideas is the effect, and the addiction is the cause.
The cause of the relationship.
Of the relationship that allows these ideas to pass to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but when it comes to, your question was really alluding to how do I help this spirit? Well, the key thing is that you can sort of have a dialogue and say, well, listen to what he has to say about the issue of motherhood or parenthood. But until you look at this issue, can you see
This
from
spirit
this
won't be confronted.
Yeah, can you see from the diagram that the best way to help this spirit would actually be to deal with the codependent addiction between the two of you?
Yeah.
And it's an excellent question because this happens in our audiences
All the time.
Just all the time. And so when whoever you are in an audience and you find ideas being impressed upon you, a very, very good thing to do is to say, what is the codependence I have with spirits around me? What is the emotional charge between me and spirits that makes me open to their ideas? And we often try to help spirits based on what we feel happening between this codependence happening between the spirit and the person on earth in the audience. So yesterday, the channeling was of some spirits who were influencing some people here.
And we focused on their beliefs and motivations for doing so.
And the codependence.
So we focused on their addiction, but not yours.
Yes. Yeah. Which helped them.
Which helped them, but it doesn't help you because you still got the same addiction, and so other spirits can now come along and do the same thing with you, right?
If you're very self-reflective, it can help you because you'll apply it. Yeah.
So one of the reasons why we find it quite interesting doing seminars is because there's a lot of spirits come, and then we get to talk to those spirits and we get to help those spirits, but oftentimes we don't get to help anybody in the audience because they stay with their addiction that they had before the event began, and they continue that addiction after the event ended. And at the end of the day, the next time we see the same people, they're going to bring another group of spirits, not the same group as before because they've probably grown, but they'll bring another group of spirits who also have the same addictions with the people now, and then we've got to do the same thing again. So it's handy having you here for the spirit's sake, but how is it going to be handy for your sake? For your sake, it's going to have to be dealing with the addiction, which is the sin. And this is why on this trip we've been sort of trying to focus groups. Remember in Canada we're focusing people on sin, and we did the same in North Carolina as well, trying to focus on sin, what the primary sins are, because these things will change you and therefore change the influences upon you. Yeah. A lot of what we believe is good ends up being so bad for us spiritually, but we're not measuring the negative results, we're only measuring the good. And this is something that most of us in delusion do. We have a habit of just going, oh, but you know, the good thing outweighs the bad, but we're not seeing the long-term bad. We only usually see the instant bad, and even then, for most people, don't even see that. Right? Don't even see the instant bad that's happening. And this is a part of our sin. Our sin tries to convince you, your sin will convince you, that there is no instant bad and there's no long-term bad. There's only good from your sin. Right? And this is an example of that. Thinking that this and this is good. Many men believe this and this is good. Almost every young man who comes to help us in God's way believes in these two things. They're good. And they often try to engage women while they're there. You know, there's some quite developed women working with us, and they are very lovely people to deal with. And so a lot of men who come start feeling sexually attracted to them and everything, and then they want these two things from them. And the women are going, now you want me to be a sexy mother, I'm not having it, you know, get going. And the men get all offended and all upset about that, but it's very good because it causes you to look at the addiction, which is the cause of the emotions coming and the binding with the spirit, but it's also the net cause of the ideas of that spirit entering you as well. Yeah. Now, of course, it's only spirits who are in an undeveloped condition, when I say undeveloped, who are anywhere below this, you know, sixth sphere of the spirit world, who will do these things.
It is interesting, Mike, just as an aside, that it was a spirit who feels very arrogant about motherhood that planted the idea, and this was the idealised
exact addiction that
concept
you have,
that came up in Canada. So you've had lots of clues.
Does that make sense? Yeah. And quite often we do get lots of clues. It's like, you know, it's not like rocket science often. It's just very basic, like.
Just that we covet our addictions so much. We think they're precious to us.
Two-element science, it is sort of thing. You know, like salt. You know, sodium and chloride. two things only. And oftentimes it's like that with our emotional state. There's only a couple of things that we're just not identifying that are causing a lot of our difficulties.
And as you often say, simple to deal with.
Simple to deal with.
Yep.
Easy to deal with. If you find addictions easy to deal with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's probably time for some lunch, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, 1 o'clock. So so this morning you can consider as a little aside. It was a 2-hour or whatever aside, but it was just a little aside. This afternoon we'd like to get back on topic, and that will be discussing a bit. We want to channel some more spirits this afternoon, so we'll probably try to do that straight after lunch. And then we'll talk about what the issues are that those spirits have faced. Now, there's 2 groups of spirits who've been lining up in a row, and we're not sure which ones will which ones we will deal with first. So Mary and I will discuss that at lunchtime and then work it out after then. But tomorrow morning, what we want to do is sort of change tack a little bit tomorrow morning and focus on some false beliefs about the human soul. Does that make sense? Because the 2 most important subjects I feel you can deal with false beliefs are God and then you. You know, because that is what's going to help you with your relationship with God, dealing with those things. So that's why we want to start focusing tomorrow morning on you, the human soul, as well. All right? We'll see you in half an hour.